I think this is, we only have 4 speakers today. I think it's one of the least I've had as president. So here we go. Oh, Mr. Garcia, I believe you're first. Welcome.
Mr. President, Mr. Superintendent, board members, thank you for having me here. My comments are directed at two of the board members today. First of all, congratulations, Mr. Wofford, on your election to the school board. On 13 October, during the LCPS board forum between you and candidate Macha, you stated, and I quote, "I think there's some sense that it's unpatriotic if we do not teach, George Washington crossing the what have you. Everything, the myths of our childhood. The myths of our childhood," in reference to George Washington crossing the Delaware, not the what have you. This was one of 3 other similar comments in your briefing. So now the question is, how much damage and indoctrination did you, Mr. Wofford, inject in our kids over 34 years as an educator through your personal ideology? And now that you're in a position to create policy, how much more damage are you going to cause in our kids' education? Board Member Tenorio, on or about 23 September, you were emailed various times and asked if you, in fact, pledged to teach CRT, even if it was against the law in New Mexico. And if you could explain if this allegation was correct. You never answered. On 17 December, you were quoted on KRWG. "The policies that we have in place that are supposed to work don't work, and students don't feel seen," Tenorio said. "And when they are seen, they don't feel understood, and they're mistreated. So the policy needs to change." As a good citizen, asking an elected official, I asked various times, what proof or data do you have to issue this statement to better understand, so we could better understand why you were supporting JBD, policy JBD? No response. So the question is this all hyperbole and unsubstantiated data to push a narrative, or lack of transparency by an elected official who refuses to engage with the citizens and displays no accountability except to those she's beholden to? Still waiting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Next up, I'd like to ask Mr. Rob Wood, if you would please. Welcome.
My name is Rob Wood. Good evening, President Jaramillo and other board members and Superintendent Ramos. After months of attending these meetings and listening to the public comments opposing the adoption of policies JBC and JBD and reading your briefs, I am drawn back to a 1960s ballad sung by Arlo Guthrie, Alice's Restaurant. In that ballad, the defendant of an accused crime presents his evidence to the judge, dozens of photographs with circles and arrows defining the absurdity of the accusation. He then looked up to discover the judge was blind. The crime in our case is the accusation that the citizens of this community have segregated out and discriminated against certain groups of people. To some degree, this may be unfortunately true, since a tribal nature is a flawed default of the human race that we try collectively and as individuals to overcome. However, both policies further segregate out, and even though not written into the policies, create discriminatory classifications for other groups, making policies divisive and thus completely unjust. I am confident that this board has honorable intentions and is not attempting to defend the discriminatory ways at a smaller scale of the Jim Crow South, the caste system of India, the racial laws of 1930s fascist Europe, the apartheid of South Africa, and the religious categorizations of the former Yugoslavia. But these policies further degrade the system of democracy we flourish under. These policies are toxic to our well-being, as they teach children a sense of tribalism that gravitates to infighting and rivalry, undermining any sense of a pluralistic democratic society, which is what defines American culture. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Next up, I'd like to ask, I believe it's Mr. Jim New. Welcome.
Thank you, President Jaramillo. Thank you, Vice President Tenorio and Secretary Cooper, Secretary Court, Board Member Wofford and Board Member Cooper, and our Superintendent, Mr. Ramos. Thank you for allowing me the time to speak. At the last LCPS board meeting 2 weeks ago, a board member and fellow American discussed his support of LCPS policy JDB, Gender Inclusive Schools, and stated in part, we are not doing anything with athletics. We are following NMAA rules. The NMAA handbook, section 6, eligibility bylaw 6.1, student participation states in part, participating students are required to compete in the gender listed on their original or amended birth certificate. LCPS policy JDB states in part that the LCPS Board of Education recognizes the importance of an inclusive approach toward transgender and gender and gender expansive students regarding sports. LCPS policy JDB allows for transgendered females, biological men, to compete against biological women. NMAA's bylaws and LCPS policies are in conflict on this issue. I ask you to either remove the word sports from the LCPS policy JDB or include the sentence, participating students are required to compete in the gender listed on their original or amended birth certificate. And again, that's from NMAA handbook section 6, eligibility bylaw 6, or LCPC policy JDB. Thank you for your time and your service on the LCPS Board of Directors and my fellow Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. New.